nowadays it seems like there's a lot more globalization that's happened. Obviously there's cultural differences, but people are more exposed to what's going on overseas, the Western world, and they're happy to import it, right? So like in a case like Grab, which is like a like a similar thing as Lyft or Uber, but they do it much better, or they did much better than Uber in the end. And why do you think that what do you think was the main difference between the two?
Between Uber and Grab.
The Grab and Uber, yeah, because
Right.
Uber had to sell off their shares.
Yeah. I think it ultimately comes down to localization, right?
Mm.
Um, when Uber came in, they came in very aggressively, looking to expand and and to do it in their own way, as opposed to working with regulatory frameworks, which you have a lot of in Asia.
Mm.
So, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think basically what they did wrong was not working in line with these already existing regulatory frameworks. Whereas Grab, for example, they made it very localized. They advertised for locals. They integrated with taxi companies, and that's how they could expand. Um, Even simple things like Uber was cashless, and in a Southeast Asian economy, maybe that's not the best way to go. Whereas Grab had cash options, and when Grab was expanding to other countries in Southeast Asia, I felt like Uber was maybe just looking to expand just to get market share in other countries as well, as opposed to actually localizing to suit the markets there. So I think that would have been the main thing that made them fail
Yeah.
in Asia.
Well, you do touch on a good point, because it seems like culturally, a lot of the American companies, or maybe Western in that aspect, want to disrupt, right? They want to disrupt industries. They don't care about regulations, or they make it look like they don't care about regulations and try to get in there and then have regulations kind of catch up,
Yeah.
right? Whereas, and this is probably a very cultural thing for Asia, people are more afraid of governments,
Yeah.
and they would rather stick with governmental rules, and then work with the government to expand their business.
For
so
sure.
they always want to talk to the governments and talk about how they can fit in with the local communities or local country and with their rules, and then hand in hand grow their business, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, like part of the reason why Uber failed as well is because, well, taxi companies are not going to be happy, right? If you come in there just looking to get as huge of a market share as possible without considering local needs, the fact that you're pushing out a large, group of people who rely on this as their occupation, you have to consider the needs of the people whom you are taking that share away from. So
That's also very considerate too, right?
yeah,
Because
of course,
for
yeah.
for Uber, they didn't really care, right? So
They didn't care, but in conservative Asian markets, they're gonna look at, people that come in from the outside, like, no, you're coming in and taking my share. I'm not gonna stand for this, and they're not gonna be very welcoming in that sense. So there was a lot of tension in that aspect, I guess. Whereas for Grab, because they integrated so well with taxi companies here, and it was more about providing safe taxi services for consumers, and not just slashing prices, which is great for consumers, yeah. But when you have hundreds of thousands of taxi drivers in one country and it's such a huge part of the economy here, you can't ignore it, right?
yeah, sure.
So
And it creates employment, right?
yeah, exactly.
And working with taxi companies to ensure that they will continue to have a job, whether they work for a taxi company. Because I find that initially when Grab did join hands with the taxi companies, and I asked the taxi drivers, are you actually working for a Grab, or does Comfort, the government taxi company, allow you to work for Grab at the same time? It's like, oh yeah, no problem. We could choose whatever we want to, and that really surprised me.
Exactly, because they had that additional option, right? As opposed to like, these private drivers are coming in, their rides are cheaper. Obviously, everyone's going to go for them, and then there's a lot of unhappiness surrounding it. Whereas now, I mean, it's not as good for the consumer, obviously, because you get surge pricing and things like that. But ultimately, it's about finding that that middle ground that makes everyone happy, and Grab did very well in that aspect, and Uber didn't.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I sometimes I think maybe for the American ones, which are very disruptive and try to create new ideas. But for the rest of, maybe even for the rest of the world, do you think that the Asian model would fit more even across Western countries than the other way around?
Again, what is the Asian model, right?
Yeah.
Because Asia in itself is huge, and local markets, they all differ hugely. So what do you mean by an Asian model? Like,
Well, like working with the governments together, as I said, bringing in everybody so that they don't lose a job and they can continue, but also using that technology to enhance their lives.
yeah, for sure, because the infrastructure varies so much in each country. You have to take into account that sort of ecosystem as well, right? You can't just come in expecting the country to be able to adapt to what you're offering. You have to come in and fill in the gap, I feel. So in that sense, yeah, you definitely have to work more with the government because they will be able to understand the needs of their citizens best. I don't think it's a matter of giving in to regulatory frameworks. It's about working with them to provide a service that has not been provided before. That's the best way to go about getting consumers in the first place, right? So
And just taking the taxi business, though, it's such a monopolized business, right? Any country you go, generally, the government definitely has a piece of that business. So taxi itself, or taxi in itself, is a very well, especially let's talk about Singapore. I mean, you can find taxis anywhere, right? So where was that gap? Where was that gap where the government wasn't providing transportation for the people that made Grab or Uber successful initially to take over parts of that taxi business?
I think it's purely just pricing.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what it worked on, and that's what worked, obviously, for consumers. Because, I mean, Singapore's not exceptionally expensive when it comes to taxis, but it is compared to the rest of Southeast Asia, right? So if you give people more options, they're going to take it anyway, even if it's marginally cheaper.
Or do you think it was like convenience as well? Because yes, there was an app for the taxis, but it was pretty shitty, right? I mean, the experience that you get from getting an Uber or Grab, it's pretty seamless.
True.
Every time it gets better. I think their algorithm that makes it much quicker, and they learn the best routes and all that. Whereas
Sure, the user experience is just a lot better, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned about credit card integration. I mean, I had many times here when I got into a cab and they only took cash, or they asked me where I'm going and refused to take me into certain locations. So obviously there were a lot of, for me, I mean, there was a lot of dissatisfaction about the experience where, I think technology just removed that completely when Grab and Uber came in.
Well, that's exactly like what you were saying just now about the gap, right? Because now people have more options, like you said, when you're going out late at night and you're trying to get a cab and they're not going to pick you up because they have a destination in mind. Sometimes you just want to get home and you don't mind paying that extra surcharge just to get home. So at least now you have that option.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the aspects that it provided for people here that wasn't being addressed before. Yeah.
Future Design Podcast.